The year is 1941. The United States reels from the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, a wound that ignites a furious, unified determination across the entire nation. The echoes of bombs and torpedoes are still reverberating across the Pacific, but already, an unprecedented mobilization effort is beginning, poised to fundamentally transform every facet of American industry and society. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a masterful communicator and empathetic leader, rises to the occasion. His iconic fireside chats, delivered with a calm yet resolute voice, carry a resonant message of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering unity into every American home, from bustling city apartments to remote farmhouses. In our familiar timeline, the home front truly coalesced under the banner of total war. Millions of women streamed into the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling vital roles in factories and offices. Rationing became a collective, patriotic way of life embraced by every citizen. And the nation's immense industrial might was fully dedicated to the war effort, ultimately propelling the Allies to a hard-won victory. But what if, at this critical juncture, a profoundly different domestic strategy for financing and prosecuting the war had been chosen? What if, instead of relying heavily on traditional methods like the sale of war bonds, voluntary conservation efforts, and incremental increases in taxation, the U.S. government had opted for a truly radical, almost revolutionary, approach: full nationalization of key industries for the war effort? This isn't just about wartime control. It's about a fundamental redefinition of the American economic soul. Welcome to a What If, and today, we're plunging into a command economy at war. What if FDR nationalized major U.S. industries for World War II? Our point of divergence takes us to the tumultuous early months of 1942. Imagine the Oval Office, its air thick with the scent of pipe smoke, the immense weight of a world at war palpable in every corner. President Roosevelt, facing the monumental task of converting a sprawling, somewhat fragmented capitalist civilian economy into a streamlined, unstoppable arsenal of democracy, meticulously scrutinizes every conceivable option. The initial weeks of war have revealed bottlenecks, corporate squabbles over lucrative war contracts, and a perceived slowness in the complete transition from peacetime consumer production to full military output. Reports from his advisors paint a grim picture of competing interests, delayed material deliveries, and a lack of singular focus. Perhaps, in a moment of desperate strategic pragmatism, he looks not to ideological purity but to raw, brute force efficiency. He considers the Soviet model of centralized planning not as an ideological blueprint to be emulated in peacetime, but as a perceived pathway to rapid, unbridled industrial output in a desperate struggle for national survival. He calls a series of clandestine, high-stakes meetings with his closest cabinet members, figures like Henry Morgenthau Jr. and Harry Hopkins, and a select few, trusted congressional leaders. His argument is bold, almost unthinkable, and deeply shocking to many. Gentlemen, he might gravely state, his voice low but firm, we are fighting for our very existence. Can we truly afford the luxury of corporate competition when the enemy is unified in its destructive purpose? Can we prioritize private gain and shareholder dividends when the nation's survival quite literally hangs in the balance? The very structure of our economy, designed for peace, is hindering our ability to wage total war. He argues that market forces are too slow, too self-interested, too susceptible to disruption to meet the unparalleled demands of global conflict. Only direct, unified government control, he posits, can mobilize resources with the speed and precision required. A fierce, passionate, and often heated debate would undoubtedly ensue behind closed doors. Opponents, including staunch conservatives and business leaders, would issue dire warnings of socialism, communism, and the destruction of American freedom. They would argue that the ingenuity of private enterprise, though seemingly slower, would ultimately prove more adaptable and innovative. Proponents, however, would counter with the undeniable urgency of the situation, the immense, escalating cost of the war, and the seemingly boundless resources and authority of the federal government once fully unchained. They would cite examples of bottlenecks and price gouging, arguing that nationalization was a necessary evil for the greater good. Amidst the shock and the impassioned arguments, and with the wartime emergency fully declared and the nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor's visceral shockwave, a deeply reluctant Congress, swayed by overwhelming national unity, the pervasive fear, and the stark reality of the existential threat, narrowly, perhaps by the slimmest of margins, grants him this unprecedented authority under the umbrella of wartime powers. This monumental legislation, passed amidst hushed urgency and extraordinary circumstances, effectively allows the government to seize direct control of the nation's industrial heartland. Suddenly, the behemoths of American industry, the sprawling steel mills of U.S. Steel and Bethlehem Steel, the colossal automotive giants like General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler with their transformative assembly lines, the vital shipbuilding yards from Newport News to Electric Boat, the cutting-edge aircraft manufacturing plants of Boeing, Lockheed, and Curtiss-Wright, and even critical raw material production like oil from Standard Oil and Texaco, all fall under the direct purview of the federal government. Assets are nationalized, existing corporate shares are exchanged for government-issued long-term bonds, and private corporate boards are dissolved, replaced by federal administrators. It is a revolution, not driven by a long-held ideological conviction, but by the raw, desperate necessity of wartime survival. The shockwaves reverberate from Wall Street to every factory town. The nation holds its breath, embarking on an economic experiment that will forever redefine its destiny. The immediate impact of this decision would be a dramatic, almost unimaginable, transformation of the entire American economic landscape. Corporations that were once the quintessential symbols of capitalist enterprise, embodying individual initiative, market competition, and the pursuit of profit, become, overnight, direct agencies of the federal government. Their intricate production lines, their vast networks of national and international suppliers, and their millions of skilled and unskilled employees would no longer be driven by market forces, but would be fully integrated into a singular, overarching, top-down war plan. This plan is orchestrated by a newly empowered and all-encompassing War Production Board, WPB, whose reach now extends into every major industrial facet of the nation, from the mines extracting ore to the assembly lines rolling out finished tanks. This WPB, under a powerful, almost dictatorial figure like a new, even more authoritative version of Donald Nelson or Bernard Baruch, would wield absolute and unquestionable authority. Its directives would not be suggestions, guidelines, or requests for tenders, but unassailable commands, backed by the full weight of wartime law and the threat of severe penalties for non-compliance. Every rivet, every ton of steel, every barrel of oil, every ounce of rubber, every piece of specialized machinery, and every skilled hand would be allocated and directed with surgical precision according to the war's most pressing and constantly evolving needs. Management, engineers, and millions of blue-collar workers would, in effect, become government employees. Their individual skills, their collective labor, and even their geographic location would be dictated and directed wherever the WPB deemed most critical, regardless of pre-war corporate affiliations, regional loyalties, or individual preferences. The concept of job mobility would be replaced by assignment to critical production. Labor disputes would be centrally mediated or even forbidden in vital sectors, with the national interest always paramount. The primary motive of profit, which had driven American industry for generations, would literally vanish overnight. Corporate competition would be deemed a wasteful luxury, an inefficiency in the face of total war. Instead, the entire system would be replaced solely by the relentless, singular pursuit of efficiency and maximum output, driven by quotas and national necessity. The internal competition that once characterized these industries, the quest for market share, the development of proprietary technologies for competitive advantage, the advertising wars for consumer loyalty, would be subsumed by a unified, national purpose. Imagine vast industrial complexes, once fierce rivals, now seamlessly sharing blueprints, specialized machinery, research findings, and even workforce training programs and best practices, all under a single, federal banner. Production secrets would become national assets, freely distributed to optimize overall output. The concept of intellectual property as a private commodity would be redefined, if not temporarily suspended, in the overriding interest of collective victory. Innovation would not cease, but its direction would be centrally planned, focusing intensely on military advantage, production efficiency, and resource conservation rather than consumer appeal. This could lead to a rapid acceleration of certain technologies, like jet propulsion or radar, as all national scientific and engineering talent is marshaled directly by the state. The sheer speed and scale of wartime production could be truly immense, perhaps even surpassing our historical reality, which was already an industrial miracle. With all resources, all labor, and all innovation directed single-mindedly towards the war effort, unburdened by corporate squabbles, the protection of proprietary secrets, or the demands of distant shareholders, the arsenal of democracy might churn out an even greater volume of tanks, planes, ships, and munitions, and do so with unheard-of swiftness. This accelerated production could potentially shorten the war by crucial months, or even significantly reduce Allied casualties on battlefields around the globe, from the sands of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific and the skies over Europe. Naval engagements might be won faster with an unparalleled, continuously replenished fleet. Ground offensives, such as those in North Africa or the relentless push after D-Day, could be bolstered by an almost endless supply of armor, artillery, and logistical support. Air superiority could be achieved not just through technological advancement, but through sheer numbers that overwhelm the enemy's capacity to resist. The logistical nightmare of supplying a global war would still exist, but the domestic production pipeline, now a single, gargantuan entity, would be optimized to an extreme degree, ensuring that forces on the front lines rarely, if ever, faced shortages of American-made equipment. This could mean earlier victories, fewer lives lost, and perhaps even a different post-war map. However, this alternate reality carries profound and arguably unavoidable implications for post-war America, consequences that would stretch far beyond the battlefields and resonate for generations. The very concept of American capitalism, so central to its identity, its constitutional freedoms, and often touted as a core tenet of its exceptionalism and global influence, would be severely tested, perhaps irrevocably altered. Once the federal government takes direct, absolute control of major industries, a move unprecedented in American history outside of emergency railroad control in World War I, the process of relinquishing that control after the war would prove incredibly difficult, if not politically, economically, and socially impossible. The precedent for nationalization would be set, etched into the national consciousness as the mechanism that won the greatest war, and the genie, once out of the bottle, would be exceedingly hard to put back. Post-war America would likely emerge with a far more centralized, government-controlled economy. The industries nationalized for the war effort would, in all likelihood, remain so. Powerful political and economic arguments would be made that these industries are too big to fail, too vital to national security in an uncertain world, too efficient under public ownership, or too strategically important to be returned to potentially fickle private hands. The argument would shift from wartime necessity to national interest and stability. Instead, they might transition into massive, powerful, publicly owned corporations operating under a state mandate, resembling entities like the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, or the Postal Service, but on a monumental, nationwide scale spanning heavy industry, transportation, and potentially even major utilities. The symbiotic, yet often tense, relationship between the government and the economy would be fundamentally and permanently altered, shifting significantly closer to a European social democracy or even a distinct American form of democratic socialism. Private enterprise would undoubtedly still exist, perhaps flourishing in smaller sectors, consumer services, and niche markets not deemed strategic by the state. But the commanding heights of the economy, the foundational industries that truly power a nation, from steel production to automobile manufacturing to energy and transportation, would remain firmly under state control. The traditional landscape of corporate giants driving innovation and employment would be profoundly reshaped, giving way to a more collective, state-directed industrial model, where public service becomes the primary corporate mission, overseen by a new class of technocrats and government administrators. The human factor in this scenario is crucial, a deep and complex layer woven into the fabric of daily life for every citizen. How would ordinary Americans react to this seismic shift, not just during the patriotic fervor of war, but in the long, grinding peace that followed? Would the factory workers, whose livelihoods and workplaces suddenly belong to the state, feel an intense surge of loyalty and collective purpose, translating into unprecedented productivity and a new sense of national pride in their labor for the common good? The narrative of working for the nation, rather than working for the boss, could be a powerful motivator. Or would a quiet, simmering dissatisfaction emerge from the perceived loss of individual autonomy, entrepreneurial opportunity, and the potential for bureaucratic inefficiencies that even centralized systems can breed? This radical shift could indeed ignite unprecedented levels of output during the war, but it could also lead to a new, complex type of labor conflict in peacetime, with the omnipresent federal government becoming the direct, singular employer and, thus, the singular target of any worker grievances or demands for better conditions. The relationship between labor unions and the state would be profoundly redefined. Unions might become integral, albeit subordinate, parts of the state apparatus, perhaps losing some of their independent bargaining power and transforming into more administrative bodies focused on fulfilling state quotas, or they might become the primary vehicle for worker representation and collective action directly against the central authority, posing unique political challenges to the ruling party and potentially igniting social unrest if demands aren't met. Consider the global ripple effect, the seismic impact this American economic transformation would have on international relations and ideological alignments in the post-war world. How would other nations, particularly the remaining allies and the defeated Axis powers, react to such a radical economic model in the United States? Allied nations like Great Britain, while undoubtedly grateful for the accelerated flow of war materials that arguably shortened the conflict, might view this transformation with a mix of apprehension and deep ideological discomfort. Winston Churchill, a staunch defender of free markets and individual liberty, might privately express deep concerns about America's economic direction, even as British ports gratefully welcomed convoys filled with state-produced American goods. This fundamental divergence in economic philosophy could strain the special relationship in the post-war era, as Britain, even under a Labour government, might still view American state control with suspicion, despite its own moves towards nationalization. Conversely, the Soviet Union would likely view this as a powerful, albeit unexpected and ideologically distinct, validation of their own centralized economic system. While they would still criticize American democracy and political freedoms, they might see it as a significant, even positive, step away from decadent capitalism, potentially influencing their post-war geopolitical calculations and even their propaganda campaigns, which could now claim that even the mighty US had to embrace central planning for success. The Lend-Lease program, instead of facilitating private sector sales, would become a direct, government-to-government transfer of state-produced war material, fundamentally altering the dynamics of post-war aid and international finance, and potentially making the US seem less overtly benevolent or more ideologically aligned with state control. For the Axis powers, especially Nazi Germany, if it hadn't already fallen by the time the effects were truly felt, and Imperial Japan, American nationalization would be a propaganda windfall beyond measure. Their broadcasts would undoubtedly seize upon it, trumpeting to the world that American capitalism has failed, replaced by a form of state socialism mirroring the Soviets. This narrative, however, could be a double-edged sword for the Axis. While it might harden the resolve of some anti-communist or anti-socialist elements in occupied Europe, it would also significantly blur the ideological lines for others. The war, for the Axis, would no longer be solely against Western democracy and plutocratic capitalism, but against a hybrid economic system that seemed to share fundamental characteristics with their Soviet enemy. This could complicate recruitment for anti-Bolshevik legions or even sow confusion among populations, undermining the clear democracy versus totalitarianism narrative that the Allies sought to project. The Cold War, when it inevitably began, would unfold on a vastly different ideological battleground, its contours reshaped by this American economic metamorphosis. A United States with partially nationalized industries would effectively lose the clean, stark ideological contrast that defined its rivalry with the Soviet Union in our timeline. The simple, powerful rhetoric of free markets versus communism would be significantly harder to maintain and would lack its powerful resonance on the global stage. American leaders would be forced to articulate a more nuanced ideology, perhaps promoting a democratic socialism that champions collective welfare, state planning, and nationalized industries while steadfastly upholding individual liberties, democratic elections, and the rule of law, a direct and crucial counterpoint to the Soviet Union's authoritarian, one-party communist model. This could lead to a less rigid, more complex geopolitical struggle, one where ideological lines were less clear-cut, potentially allowing for greater gray areas, more nuanced alliances, or even unexpected partnerships based on shared democratic values rather than purely economic models. Or, paradoxically, it might intensify the ideological battle as both sides claim to represent the true path to societal well-being and economic justice, debating the merits of state control within different political frameworks. The very foundations of post-war international institutions, from the United Nations to the nascent global trade organizations like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which might be structured very differently, perhaps with a greater emphasis on state-led development and less on market liberalization, would be profoundly shaped by this new American economic identity, potentially leading to different forms of economic aid, reconstruction efforts, and development models for rebuilding war-torn Europe and Asia. The Iron Curtain might still fall, but its ideological texture would be far more complex, a tapestry woven with different shades of state intervention. Culturally, American society would also diverge sharply from our known history. The immense power and pervasive influence of large, privately owned corporations on politics, media, and popular culture would be significantly diminished. No longer would corporate advertising dominate airwaves or billboards in the same way, as the main producers would be state entities with different motivations. The era of the organization man, so iconic of mid-20th century America, might take on a wholly different meaning, deeply intertwined with state employment and national service rather than corporate loyalty or entrepreneurial ambition. The traditional American dream of building a corporate empire, founding a successful startup, or striking it rich through private enterprise might be replaced by a new ideal, contributing to the collective good through the nationalized industries, perhaps aspiring to leadership roles within the vast state apparatus or excelling in government-funded research. The entrepreneurial spirit, while certainly not extinguished entirely, Americans are inherently innovative, might be redirected, focusing on smaller, independent ventures, local businesses, or on innovation within the vast nationalized system, perhaps through government-funded research and development initiatives focused on public benefit rather than private profit. Academic research, too, might see increased state funding and direction, steering talent towards nationally important projects. The iconic post-war consumer boom, so intertwined with the rapid return of private enterprise, mass-produced consumer goods, and pervasive advertising in our timeline, might be substantially delayed or take a fundamentally different form. With strategic industries focused primarily on national needs, long-term state planning, and perhaps export for international influence, the variety, novelty, and sheer quantity of consumer goods might remain limited for longer. The emphasis might shift from individual consumption and material accumulation to collective well-being, massive public works projects, like a truly ambitious national rail network, a universal energy grid, or extensive public housing initiatives, and state-sponsored cultural initiatives and public services. Labor unions, potentially absorbed into or working directly with the government structure, would evolve along radically different lines, their historical role as a powerful counterbalance to private corporate power having fundamentally changed. They might become facilitators of government policy and worker welfare within the nationalized system rather than antagonists. Education might emphasize vocational training aligned with national industrial needs, and even popular culture, from Hollywood films to radio programs, could subtly shift to reinforce themes of collective effort, national purpose, and the benefits of a planned economy, potentially leading to less individualistic or consumerist storytelling and more narratives about national heroes and collective achievement. The public square might feel more cohesive, but also potentially less diverse in its economic discourse. In this what-if-a world, the desperate urgency of total war pushes America into an unprecedented economic experiment, a societal metamorphosis on a scale rarely seen in democratic nations. The nation, in its desperate fight for freedom abroad, radically redefines its own economic system, creating a legacy that reshapes its future far beyond the battlefield. This profound transformation begs the ultimate question: how much are we truly willing to change ourselves to secure our survival, and what kind of nation emerges from such a profound metamorphosis? What would America truly stand for in a world where its economic soul had been so dramatically reshaped by the crucible of war? The answers would echo through generations, carving out a distinctly different path for the American century, one filled with its own unique triumphs, challenges, and definitions of liberty and prosperity, irrevocably altered by a choice made in the darkest hour.